the assumption of the unique moral virtue of the United States, the assertion of its mission to reform the world, to redeem the world by spreading its professed ideals and the American way of life, and the faith in the nation's preordained destiny. The theological framework undercuts reasoned debate, and it reduces policy to a choice between good and evil, therefore reducing the ever-present threat of democracy. Critics can be dismissed as anti-American, an interesting concept borrowed from the lexicon of totalitarianism. The issue of defense against Britain, the only potential enemy, never even arose remotely. The British Minister Castlereagh, was so eager to cement Anglo-American relations that he even overlooked Jackson's murder of 2 innocent British citizens, which Adams defended for, as he put it, for its salutary efficacy for terror and example. Weeks suggests that Adams was heeding the words of Tacitus, his favorite historian, that crime once exposed had no refuge but in audacity. The goal of Adams's diplomacy had nothing to do with security. It was territorial expansion to the Pacific. And that was finally achieved, although in one sense the British threat was not overcome. British military force barred the intended conquest of Canada and Cuba. As for Cuba, Adams predicted that it would drop into U.S. hands like a ripe fruit by the laws of political gravitation once the U.S. had succeeded in overcoming its British enemy. And by the end of the century, the laws of political gravitation were working, and the U.S. was able to intervene to bar Cuba's liberation from Spain. That's what we call liberating Cuba, but in fact it was preventing the liberation of Cuba and turning Cuba into a virtual colony of the United States, quoting 2 respected Harvard historians, quite conservative, until 1959, when we had to turn to international terrorism and illegal embargo to restore this story. Well, filling in the blanks, the actual picture does support Gaddis's judgments about the precedents for the Bush Doctrine and its implementation. As for the expansion of the doctrine to the entire world, others may judge for themselves, and the world has judged. As international polls have shown, fear and often hatred of the United States has risen to unprecedented heights, significantly increasing the threat of terror and also the likelihood of ultimate doom. Well, to summarize briefly, there is a spectrum of opinion on the resort to military force. At one extreme, so remote from received opinion that it's scarcely even mentioned, is the post-war consensus formally articulated in the UN Charter, the Nuremberg Tribunal, and subsequent extensions of these principles. The rest of the spectrum, meaning about 100% of it, basically adopts the principle that the United States is uniquely exempt from international law and is entitled to resort to any measures it chooses to respond to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige, and to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Just quoting again from the left liberal end of the consensus. The more honest are explicit in declaring these rights to be restricted to the U.S. and its clients, not to be universalized. But I have to stress again that the American public is off the spectrum. It seems to keep firmly to the post-war consensus, which is virtually excluded, totally excluded, in fact, from the political system, and virtually excluded from articulate opinion, except at the margins. Now, at the margins, we do find more nuanced opinions on the resort to force. One of the most important is the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Kosovo War. It was headed by the distinguished South African jurist, Justice Richard Goldstone. the Commission rendered the harshest criticism of the NATO bombing anywhere near the mainstream, concluding that the bombing was illegal but legitimate. That's the phrase they used. They said it was illegal because it did not receive approval from the UN Security Council, but it was legitimate because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted and there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo. Justice Goldstone concluded from this that the UN Charter may need revision in the light of the report of his commission and the judgments on which it's based. The NATO intervention, he explains, is too important a precedent for it to be regarded as an aberration. Rather, state sovereignty is being redefined in the face of globalization and by the resolve of the majority of the peoples of the world that human rights have become the business of the international community. And he also stressed the need for objective analysis of human rights abuses. Actually, that last comment is good advice, so let's follow it. One question that an objective analysis might address is whether indeed the majority of the world's peoples accept the judgment of the enlightened states. Well, you can review the world press and official statements, and you find that that's totally false. In fact, the bombing of Serbia was bitterly condemned outside the NATO countries. Very little of it reported here. Furthermore, it's hardly likely that the self-exemption of the enlightened states from the UN Charter and the Nuremberg Principles would gain the approval of much of the world's population. Well, another question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed, to quote Goldstone, all diplomatic options had been exhausted in Kosovo. It's easy to check. When NATO decided to bomb, there were two diplomatic options on the table. There was a NATO proposal and a Serbian proposal. The latter kept from the public here, but it's a public document. After 78 days of bombing, a compromise was reached between them. Okay? That indicates that diplomatic options were indeed available. A third question is, quoting again, whether there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, as the Commission asserted, obviously a crucial matter. Well, here objective analysis happens to be unusually easy. There is a vast documentary record available from impeccable Western sources that includes several compilations, big compilations put together by the State Department, released in justification for the war, the detailed records of the OSCE, of NATO, the United Nations, lengthy and detailed British parliamentary inquiry, and other similar sources. They all reach the same conclusion. The killings and atrocities followed the bombing, as the Milosevic indictment itself indicates. Take a look at it. It's for crimes committed after the bombing, with a marginal exception. And as the NATO command had announced at once, and later confirmed in more detail, it was anticipated that the bombing would elicit the crimes that followed. How is this handled? Well, there's huge literature on Kosovo. After all, that was the proof of the normative revolution. It handles it very easily. It ignores the enormous documentary record entirely. Try to find a reference to it. And it's impeccable Western documentation. Couldn't get anything more reliable. And almost invariably, the literature reverses the chronology so that the bombing can be justified in response to the atrocities it elicited and is expected to elicit. Actually, I've reviewed this rather instructive record in some detail in print, and I'll skip it here. But check. Can learn a lot about ourselves. Kosovo was not a pretty place before the NATO bombing. According to Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed on all sides in the year prior to the invasion, and many of them by KLA guerrillas, Albanian guerrillas, attacking Serbs from Albania in an effort, as they quite openly announced, to elicit harsh reaction that could rally Western opinion to their cause. The British government, which was the most hawkish element in the alliance, they make the astonishing claim that until January 1999, most of the 2,000 were killed by the KLA. And Western sources consistently report that there was no significant change after January 1999 until March of that year when the bombing started. So they are basically saying that most of the killings were by then CIA-backed guerrillas attacking from Albania. That's the most hawkish element in the alliance. One of the very few scholarly studies even to consider these matters estimates that Serbs were responsible for 500 of the 2,000 killed. That's a careful and judicious study by Nicholas Wheeler, who supports the NATO bombing on the grounds that there would have been worse atrocities if NATO had not bombed. So the argument is that by bombing with the anticipation that it will lead to atrocities, NATO was preventing atrocities. That such arguments are taken seriously gives no slight insight into Western intellectual culture, particularly when we recall that there were diplomatic options and that the agreement reached after 78 days of bombing was a compromise between them, formally at least. NATO instantly got rid of the treaty that it signed and imposed its own interpretation. There's no time to review the history. Well, Kosovo was actually one of the two achievements that was brought forth to give retrospective proof that for the first time in history, states were observing principles and values, all the rest. The second example used was East Timor. That example is far more atrocious. I mean, the fact that it can even be brought up without shame is an amazing comment on Western intellectual culture, and here almost the entire West is complicit, though the U.S.-British role was the worst. Okay, that too was extensively discussed in print, so I'll skip it and end with what is commonly given as the paradigm example of selfless humanitarian intervention and is unhappily again in the news right now, namely Haiti. Well, there's no time to review the history, which is quite horrifying. The two most guilty parties are France and the United States. The U.S. role took an even uglier turn under Wilsonian idealism. Wilson's Marines invaded in 1915. They killed thousands of people, reinstituted virtual slavery, turned Haiti into an American plantation by a very simple device. The parliament was disbanded by genuine Marine Corps measures, as the commander reported. It was disbanded because it refused to accept what was called a progressive measure necessary to ensure Haiti's economic development, namely a law allowing U.S. corporations to take over the country by means quite similar to those illegally instituted by Viceroy Bremer in Iraq in the last year. Wilson's Marines then ran a free referendum, because we really believe in free elections. In the referendum, 5% of the population participated, and 99% voted in favor of the required law, for which Franklin Delano Roosevelt later took credit, rightly or not. After 19 years, the Marine occupation ended, having devastated much of the country. It left the country in the hands of the vicious National Guard that Wilson established. I'll skip the rest of the hideous story, up to 1990, when a really horrifying event took place. The country had a genuinely free election, its first. The election was won by a populist priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, while Washington's candidate, a former World Bank official, received 14% of the vote. Nobody expected that. Nobody had been paying any attention to what was going on in the slums and the hills of Haiti, where a genuine democratic culture developed in the poorest country in the hemisphere, and was able to have a democratic election of a kind that is unimaginable here. They elected their own candidate. Washington was appalled, of course, and moved at once to undermine the democratic government. And when it was overthrown by a military coup a few months later, Bush #1 and then Clinton effectively supported the military junta and its wealthy supporters. They even authorized the Texaco Oil Company to supply them with oil in violation of presidential directives, thus rendering the OAS blockade that the U.S. had been openly undermining almost entirely meaningless. After 3 years of state violence, Clinton decided that the population had suffered enough torture and murder, and he allowed President Aristide to return, but on a crucial condition, namely that he had to adopt the program of the defeated U.S. candidate in the 1990 elections. Okay, that's what we call restoring democracy in an altruistic effort at nation building. As was predicted at once, the harsh programs imposed on Haiti undermined what was left of economic sovereignty and drove the country into chaos and violence, which was accelerated by Bush II, who, when he banned international aid on completely cynical grounds. Last February, the army and the murderous junta were placed back in power with the help of France and the United States, the two most guilty parties. And now there's a new reign of terror. That's now. We read in the British press that the most publicized case is that of Gérard Jean-Just, a Catholic priest who was arrested last month at a soup kitchen that he runs for children. He's in jail without charge. Struck a note with me. I happened to meet him in 1993 when I was in Haiti at the height of the terror. He was then underground. I've been in many awful places in the world, but I have never seen anything like the terror in the slums of Port-au-Prince under the guns of the junta, and rarely anything like the misery and poverty. The junta is now back in power, thanks primarily to the nobility of our foreign policy with its saintly glow. The paradigm example of humanitarian intervention is not so simple if we take the trouble to look at the facts, always a useful exercise. Few questions are more important today than the propriety of the use of force. And no doubt one can imagine, and maybe even find, genuine cases of humanitarian intervention, but there's always a heavy burden of proof, and the historical record should give us pause, not only our own, but that of others. We might recall, for example, the observations of maybe the major scholarly study of humanitarian intervention in legal scholarship. It finds 3 examples of humanitarian intervention between the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 and the UN Charter. The 3 are Japan's invasion of Manchuria and North China, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, and Hitler's takeover of the Sudetenland. Now, it's not, of course, that the author regards these as genuine examples. Rather, they're the only potential ones there. And, of course, they were depicted as humanitarian intervention, and evidence was indeed provided, and however grotesque it was regarded with some sympathy in the United States and Britain. In fact, the use of force is almost always accompanied by professions of benign intent, near universal, predictable, therefore totally uninformative. Inquiry might also unearth genuine cases of intervention that is illegal but legitimate, although the prime example offered leaves this as a dubious doctrine for the times, and it tends to reinforce the measured judgment of the World Court in 1949, which was reaffirmed in the Nicaragua case and others that I'll quote the court. The court can only regard the alleged right of intervention as the manifestation of a policy of force, such as has in the past given rise to most serious abuses, and such as cannot, whatever be the defects in international organization, find a place in international law. From the nature of things, intervention would be reserved for the most powerful states and might easily lead to the perverting of the administration of justice itself. Now, those are words worth pondering, I think.
Thank you for those powerful words indeed. We have 10 minutes for questions. We have microphones set up. Please, given the limited amount of time Professor Chomsky has to get to the airport, be brief and do ask a question. And please identify yourself first.
Bob Thompson, alum. Why do you think that these lawyers' torture memos on the enemy combatants, which violate international law and constitutional law, are now the elite consensus of intellects and academia? And also, could you describe a little bit more the development of the cause, why they even wrote these things, and they violated human rights and justice and international law?
Well, actually, to be precise, that's not a consensus. So Gonzalez's torture memos, it came under plenty of criticism. Can you hear me? Gonzalez's torture memos came under a lot of criticism. So the idea that we have the right to commit torture and dismantle the Geneva Conventions was not an elite consensus. There was plenty of criticism of that. On that issue, there was debate. How did this come about? Well, you know the history. We're not the only country that does it. There are other countries where torture is legitimate. There's one country, our closest ally, which I believe is the only country in the world right now, at least the only Western country, in which evidence obtained under torture can be used for conviction even without supporting evidence. Okay, so torture is technically illegal, but if you get a confession under torture, it can still be used even without supporting evidence. That's Israel, where for years torture was legal. And of course it goes on all over the place. In fact, it goes on in our own prisons. But to take a stand as strong as the one that the Justice Department transmitted to Bush, that did raise objections, like the ones I quoted, in fact, which compared it to the Nazis. It's not an usual comparison at the heart of the establishment.
Could you think of or imagine any form or shape in which you might support American military action, which was taken in anticipation of, like the President's justification, in anticipation of an imminent and dangerous threat to the United States? Not that I'm justifying the President, but can you conceive of any form in which you might support such action?
Well, why don't you generalize it and say, can you conceive of any action which any state might take? Yeah, sure, you can imagine such things. I mean, suppose, let's say you're in Iran right now. Okay. Iran is, that's a real problem. Iran is surrounded, first of all, it's under attack by the world superpower with embargoes, this, that, and the other thing. It's surrounded by states either occupied by its superpower enemy or having nuclear weapons. A little way down the road is the regional superpower, which has hundreds of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction and is essentially an offshore U.S. military base and has the biggest air force and technologically most advanced air force in NATO, more than any NATO power outside the United States, and in the past year has been supplied by the global superpower with 100 advanced jet bombers, openly advertised as able to fly to Iran and back to bomb it, and also provided with I'm talking about Israel, provided with what the Hebrew press calls special weaponry. Well, nobody knows what that means, but if you're an Iranian intelligence analyst, you're going to give a worst-case analysis of it, of course, and it has actually been publicly provided with smart bombs and deep penetration weapons and so on. I mean, they have a terrific justification for anticipatory self-defense, better than any other case I can think of, but do I approve of it? Like, would I approve of their bombing Israel or carrying out terrorist acts in Washington and so on? No. Even though they have a pretty strong case, better than anything I can think of here. Just as the Japanese had a much better case than any that I can think of here, but I don't approve of Pearl Harbor. So yeah, we can conceive of cases, and in fact some of them are right in front of our eyes, but none of us approve of them, none of us. So if we don't approve of them in real cases, which are right in front of our eyes, why discuss hypothetical cases that don't exist? I mean, we could do that in some philosophy seminar somewhere. But in the real world, there are real cases that ought to concern us, not hypothetical ones that somebody can invent. And in fact, the threat of terror and weapons of mass destruction is very severe, very severe. And the Bush administration, like the Clinton administration, doesn't care about it. In fact, they are acting consciously in ways to increase the threat. Okay, so yes, it's a serious threat. We should be concerned about it. In fact, the article I quoted on the threat of ultimate doom is talking precisely about that. It's saying, yeah, we can carry out actions in a way which increase the threat of ultimate doom for ourselves and increase the threat of terror to ourselves, but we shouldn't. They say we shouldn't do it, and we should pray that China will stop us. I think we should pray that we'll stop us. And that happens all the time. I mean, like, take, say, the invasion of Iraq. There's a big debate in Washington, which is totally pointless, and in the media about whether Bush downgraded terror in order to invade Iraq. There's nothing to debate. He invaded Iraq, okay? That proves, beyond doubt, that he downgraded the threat of terror in favor of invading Iraq. They anticipated, and their own intelligence agencies told them, and everyone else did too, that invasion of Iraq was likely to increase the threat of terror. Okay. It's not a high priority. So they invaded Iraq because that's a much higher priority. So yeah, increasing the threat of terror is not a joke. You could get a nuclear weapon smuggled into a New York hotel room, and sooner or later it'll happen. And if we insist on increasing the threat of terror and increasing the threat of ultimate doom, we're likely to get it. But we don't have to think about these abstract cases. We can think about real ones.
Well, I noted that
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Anna, sorry. You noted that Clinton wanted to see unilateral military action in defense of U.S. access to markets. And I'll have to point out that this is exactly what the system of imperialism is. So therefore, how can you support simply regulating the system of imperialism? For example, I know you supported sanctions against Iraq in 1991, which led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. As well, you also supported a vote to...
This is Spartacus League?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we all know that line. It's false. It's already false, and the rest of the line, which most of us are familiar with, are false. I was always opposed to the sanctions.
It's actually not false. It's the question
fine.
of what's the way forward for the world's workers and oppressed, whether you want to continue on your...
If anybody wants the Spartacus League manifesto, pick it up at the door.
Whether you actually want to see workers take power in their own name, whether you want to see the freedom of political prisoners...
I'd love to see workers take power, but the place to organize workers is not here. If you want, I'll pay you your car fare to the nearest manufacturing plant, and you can go over and organize workers to take power. The rest of this is a waste of time. Yeah, okay. Right.
Thank you.
Fine, so go do it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student at Harvard. Wondering, what are your thoughts on how free, peaceful people can protect themselves against the threat of radical Islamic terrorism here and against civilians in other countries?
I think there's a significant literature on specialist literature on terrorism in the United States. Israeli intelligence, a lot of others. They all come to the same conclusion. The kind of terrorism we allow ourselves to talk about That is what somebody else does to us, not what we do to them. That kind of terrorism is a threat. It's double-edged. I mean, the terrorists themselves, they regard themselves as a vanguard who are trying to mobilize others. And the others are, a potential reservoir of sympathy on people who may hate them and fear them, but recognize that there's some justice to their claims. That's standard, whether it's the IRA in Northern Ireland or, Osama bin Laden in the Middle East or anything else. We have two ways. We ought to therefore have a double-edged response. With response to terrorists themselves, terrorist acts, those are criminal acts. They should be treated like criminal acts. That's police action. And that's worked. In fact, it's had successes in Europe, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, using Pakistan and other places, ordinary police measures to find criminals. That works. But the much more important question is, what about the people they're trying to mobilize? Well, there we have a choice. We can help the terrorists mobilize the vanguard by carrying out acts of violence, which will justify their message, or we can deal with the legitimate grievances of the people who they are trying to appeal to, which we ought to do independently of terrorism. Well, those are the answers to terrorism. If you want to read about them, you can read about them in any of the specialist literature or the statements of Israeli intelligence or anybody who even thinks about the matter. But we don't want to do that. The guys who run the place. They don't want to deal with the legitimate grievances because their own interests overwhelm them. And they don't care that much about the threat of terror, so they do things that exacerbate it. But we can change those policies. So I think there's a pretty clear understanding about how to deal with the category of terrorism that we allow ourselves to look at, the category in which we're the victims. And it works. So take, say, Northern Ireland. For a long time, the British responded to IRA terror, which was pretty serious, by just more violence. That's a gift to the IRA. They just organized the reservoir of sympathy and support for more terror. Actually, IRA terror was being supported from here, and like churches in Boston were supporting it. The FBI knew all about it, but they said they couldn't do anything about it. Only Saudi Arabia is supposed to stop funding terrorists. But finally, the British finally got the idea that they better look at the grievances. And they started attending to the grievances that lay beyond, that kind of were in the reservoir of potential sympathy, and it worked. It didn't work perfectly, Belfast isn't utopia, but it's a lot better than it was 10 years ago. That's the way to deal with terrorism if you're interested in dealing with terrorism. If you're not interested in dealing with it, like U.S. policy, you just carry out actions which extend and increase it.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Seth Barber. I'm Dr. Chomsky. This question is very broad, but it's on many people's minds. So I'll leave it to you to limit, as you choose the scope of its application. How do you interpret the Bush electoral victory, including the possibility of electoral fraud, and what do you think its implications and ramifications might be?
Okay. I have to tell you, a couple of months ago picked up a declassified CIA document, which is kind of intriguing. It's about the Kennedy assassination. It's from a couple of years ago. And it suggests to the government that they ought to occasionally leak information about the Kennedy assassination to the public, so they'll keep the Kennedy assassination industry going. People will continue to follow up leads and put together complicated stories, and that'll keep people away from asking the serious questions. Well, I don't know if the CIA actually does that, but it's a smart idea. And I don't know whether they're pushing the stories about electoral flaws or not, but if they're not doing their job. There are problems with the election, plenty, deep ones, but they have nothing to do with whether they counted the votes wrong in Ohio. I mean, just have a look at the elections, okay? Each candidate got the usual 30% of the vote. The Bush guys got a little more. The Kerry guys got a little less. It tells us absolutely nothing about the country. If the votes had shifted a little and Kerry had gotten a little more and Bush left, you'd have a different guy in the White House. It would still tell you nothing about the country. And the reasons are well known, and those are the serious questions. The reasons are that people, about 10% of the population, voted on what they call agenda, policy, programs, and ideas, what an election would be about in a free country. 10%. The rest voted on imagery. The elections are run by the same guys who sell you toothpaste and cars. Their job, they don't tell you when they sell a car, here are the properties of the car. I mean, if you did that, it wouldn't need advertising. That would be a market system, but we don't believe in market systems where you provide information to people. We believe in systems that are based on deceit. You have to deceive the public into carrying out what's called consumer choice by putting a sexy model in the car or having it drive up a sheer cliff or something like that. And it's the same with, that's the whole system. That's the whole system is based on deceit. And that's the opposite of a market system, I should say. And it's the same is true in the political arena. It's based on deceit. And furthermore, it's not concealed. So, take a look at yesterday's New York Times and the op-ed pages. They have two op-eds about how the Democrats could, overcome their problems. And both op-eds are, one by a professor at NYU, another one at Berkeley, are about ways to deceive the public into sneaking in your own policies by lying to them. Well, that makes perfect sense in a society that's based on deceiving the public, whether it's to undermine markets or whether it's to undermine democracy. And in fact, that's what happened. People voted for images. Bush is trained to project the image of someone who will defend you from terror and has moral values. And Kerry is trained to project the image of somebody who cares about the economy and health. And in fact, if you look at the voters, they tended to believe that the candidate they voted for had their opinion, which is totally false when you look at the actual opinions and the positions of the candidates. But you vote for the image, just like you buy a Chevrolet because of the sexy model or something. You vote for the image, and the actual attitudes of the population, I gave a sample of them before, from studies that appeared right before the election from the major institutions. They're just off the agenda totally. Just think of the things that I mentioned, and it goes on like that. They don't even appear. So people are voting for images, and, the Bush image got a little more than the Kerry image. But what it amounts to is flipping a coin for king. And if it turns out, to get back to the flaws, to the electoral vote, suppose it turns out that the coin was a little bit biased. Okay, maybe it was. That doesn't change anything. Okay, so they flipped the biased coin for the king. That's not the problem. The problem is a quite different one, and it's the different one that we ought to be concerned about.